Waife sat by the window, staring at the dim streetlights. The rain tapped softly against the glass, a rhythmic reminder of the silence that filled her home. She glanced at the clock. 10:37 p.m. Her husband was late again. She had stopped asking where he was. The excuses were always the same. Work, deadlines, meetings that never seemed to end. First she believed him. Then she stopped caring. Now she wasn't sure which was worse. The front door creaked open. His footsteps were measured, almost hesitant, as if he knew she was waiting. He didn't greet her. He placed his keys on the counter, loosened his tie, and sighed as he scrolled through his phone. "You didn't call," she said, voice soft but firm. "I was busy," he replied without looking up. The words were a knife to her chest, not because they were cruel, but because they were indifferent. She had once been his world. His best friend, his lover. Now, she was just another fixture in the house, like the couch he collapsed onto after a long day. She walked over, standing in front of him, searching for something in his expression. "Did you even think about me today?" His brows furrowed, but he didn't meet her gaze. "Waife, don't start." That was always his answer. Don't start. As if her loneliness was an inconvenience rather than a wound that bled every single day. She sat beside him, the couch sinking under their weight. For a moment, she thought about reaching for his hand, but she knew he would pull away. "Do you even love me anymore?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I married you, didn't I?" The answer crushed her. Not because it was a lie, but because it wasn't enough. She stood abruptly, her throat tightening. "I'm going to bed." He didn't stop her. He never did. As she lay under the cold sheets, she wondered if this was how marriages died. Not with fights, but with silence. The next morning she moved through the motions. Making coffee, folding laundry, cleaning a house that never felt like home anymore. Her husband left without a kiss, without a goodbye. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. Her fingers hovered over a contact she hadn't messaged in weeks. Simple name. Someone who had once made her feel something. She deleted the message before she could send it. By evening, the loneliness was suffocating. She decided to go out just for a walk, just to feel the world outside her own suffocating thoughts. She wandered into a bookstore, her fingers tracing the spines of novels she had once loved. "Didn't take you for the reading type." The voice was warm, familiar. She turned, and there he was. A face from the past. A man who once made her laugh, who once saw her before she became invisible. Her lips parted, surprise flashing in her eyes. "It's been a while." His smile was easy, effortless. Too long. For the first time in months she felt seen. Waife hadn't meant for it to turn into something. It started as a conversation, a harmless exchange between old friends. But it was the way he looked at her. Like she was still the woman she used to be, not the one who had faded into the background of her own life. They talked about books, about travel, about nothing and everything. He made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years. When she glanced at her phone, she realized an hour had passed in what felt like minutes. "You should smile more," he said. "It suits you." The compliment caught her off guard. It wasn't grand or poetic, but it was the first kind thing anyone had said to her in a long time. She felt the warmth of it settle in her chest as they exchanged numbers, promising to catch up again. First it was just messages. Short, casual, innocent. But then the messages grew longer, later into the night. He asked about her day, about her dreams, about the things she used to love before she forgot how to love them. She told herself it wasn't wrong. She wasn't doing anything bad. But then she started lying. She told her husband she was going to the store when she wasn't. She lingered in coffee shops a little too long. She found herself waiting for his replies, checking her phone more often than she should. One evening, as she stood in front of the mirror, she realized she was dressing for someone else. She had spent years wondering if her husband noticed her, and now she cared if another man did. They met again, this time in a quiet cafe. He reached across the table, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "Does he even see you?" he asked. She could have lied, could have defended her marriage. But she didn't. Because the truth was written all over her face. When he kissed her, she didn't stop him. Waife sat in her car outside the house, hands gripping the steering wheel. The weight of what she had done settled deep in her stomach, heavy and unshakable. Her lips still burned from the kiss, her skin still tingled from his touch, but the guilt was louder than anything else. She had spent years convincing herself she was a good wife, that she had done everything right, that she had waited, endured, tried. But now, she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her husband's car was in the driveway. He was home early. It was almost funny. After months of late nights and distant conversations, the one night she needed him to be absent, he was there. She stepped inside quietly. He was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up. "You're home late." She nodded, her throat dry. Lost track of time. "Where were you?" The question wasn't accusatory. He wasn't suspicious. He was just making conversation the same way someone asks about the weather. The indifference stung more than anger would have. "Just out," she said. He hummed in response and went back to his phone. That was it. No further questions. No concern. No noticing the way her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water. She hated him for that. Hated that he had made it so easy for her to betray him. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her husband's back was turned to her. His breathing slow and steady. He was close enough to touch, yet she had never felt further from him. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. Message. "Thinking about you." She turned the phone face down. Days passed, and she told herself it was over. That it had been a moment of weakness, nothing more. But temptation had a way of lingering. The texts didn't stop. Neither did the stolen moments, the excuses, the growing desire for something she couldn't name. She wasn't in love with him. At least, that's what she told herself. It wasn't about love. It was about feeling wanted. One evening, she and her husband sat across from each other at the dinner table. The silence between them was suffocating. He barely acknowledged her, eating mechanically as he scrolled through emails. She swallowed hard. "Do you ever think about us?" He looked up confused. "What do you mean?" "About our marriage. About how different things are now." He set his fork down, sighing. "Waife, we've been together for years. Things change. That doesn't mean something's wrong. But something is wrong." Her voice was quieter than she intended. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Is this about another one of those relationship books you've been reading?" She exhaled sharply. "It's about the fact that I feel like I'm married to a stranger." His jaw tightened. "What do you want me to say? That I don't work so much? That I suddenly become someone who has time for long conversations and date nights? I want you to act like you care," she said, voice shaking. "Like you actually see me." He rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into his features. "I do see you, Waife. I don't know what you want from me anymore." She wanted to tell him. She wanted to scream that she wanted him to fight for her, to notice the way she was slipping away, to give her a reason to stop before it was too late. But he didn't see the warning signs. He didn't even know there was something to fight for. So she gave up. That night, she met the other man again. She let him hold her, let him kiss away the ache in her chest. And this time she didn't feel guilty. Least not yet. Waife stood in the shower, letting the water scald her skin. She scrubbed her arms as if she could wash away the choices she had made. But no matter how hard she tried, the weight of it stayed. She had thought it would feel different. That maybe the more time she spent with him, the less guilty she would feel. But it didn't fade. It twisted inside her, a constant reminder of how far she had strayed. Her husband was still asleep when she stepped into the bedroom. His body curled toward the edge of the bed like he was trying to keep as much distance as possible. Maybe he had been doing that for years, and she had only now begun to notice. She lay down beside him, staring at the ceiling. She had to tell him. The words sat heavy on her tongue all morning. They followed her through breakfast, through the empty conversations about bills and errands. But she couldn't bring herself to say them. It wasn't until later that evening, when he came home from work, that the silence between them became unbearable. "I need to talk to you," she said, gripping the edge of the counter to keep her hands from shaking. He glanced up from his phone. "What's wrong?" She took a deep breath, the words thick in her throat. "I've been seeing someone." For a moment he didn't react. Just stared at her, as if waiting for her to take it back. Then slowly he set his phone down. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "I mean exactly what it sounds like." His expression didn't change. No anger, no immediate outburst. Just silence. "How long?" His voice was eerily calm. "A few months." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. He clenched his jaw, exhaled through his nose. "Did you sleep with him?" "Yes." The word barely left her lips before he turned away, rubbing his hands over his face. The quiet stretched between them, suffocating. She waited for him to yell, to demand answers, to tell her she had ruined everything. But he didn't. Instead, he let out a hollow laugh. "I should have seen this coming." That hurt more than anything. She took a step toward him. "I didn't plan for this to happen. But you let it." He finally looked at her, and for the first time in years, she saw something other than indifference in his eyes. Betrayal. The pieces of a marriage he thought was unbreakable, now lying at his feet. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. He shook his head. "I don't either." The hours passed in slow motion. He didn't say much. Neither did she. He sat on the couch, staring at nothing, while she sat at the table, staring at him. Finally he stood. "I need some air." She didn't stop him. When the door closed behind him, she felt the emptiness settle in. This was what she had been afraid of all along. The moment where there was no turning back. She had spent so much time convincing herself she deserved more, that she had ignored what she already had. Now, she wasn't sure if there was anything left to save.